Hi, this is Dave at Two Stroke Performance. Welcome to another video. Today I'm going to run through the process of rebuilding a power valve on a KTM 125, 150 and 200. These engines were pretty much the same from about 98 through to 2015, and the 200 was the same for 2016 as well. Both the 125 and the 150 were updated in 2016. They went to a totally new engine, but basically from when they were first started back in about 98 through until that new engine in 16, the power valve didn't change, and the process for rebuilding one is exactly the same. So I'll just quickly go through the parts that we've got. They're all laid out here. All of these have been cleaned. There's no grit or anything like that on them. They do look pretty rough though. This cylinder is off a 2007 model engine, and it's obviously had a hard life. You see there's a lot of surface rust on the top of the bolts. Everything here has been cleaned thoroughly. I've had it in an ultrasonic cleaner for about 15 or 20 minutes. So there's no loose dirt, but it obviously just doesn't look pretty, but hey, that's the reality of a lot of older engines nowadays. This one is 10 years old, so I guess it's kind of what you expect. So first of all, we've got all the bolts laid out here. You've got 6 long bolts like that with a 6mm head on them. You've got 6 short bolts, which are pretty much the same but just much shorter. And then you've got 2 bolts that are an intermediate length, or they're between the short and the long ones. These 2 intermediate length bolts come over here and sit with this retaining plate, so I'll leave them over there. The 6 long ones I mentioned up here, they're all for mounting the front cover to the cylinder, and these 6 short ones are used for various covers and bits and pieces. You've then got the main flap here, which I've just lightly polished up, or lightly cleaned up with some sandpaper. You have 2 cylinders with teeth on the end of them. This is what rotates to open the side passages of the power valve. These 2 pieces here help to open the main flap. These 2 pins come in from either side of the cylinder and hold the main flap in place. These are 2 small retaining brackets for these pins. This, I don't really even know what to call this. It's just a toothed gear or tooth bracket. This is what rotates around in an arc to open and close the power valve. And then these are just side covers for the side of the cylinder. So they're all the parts. I'd suggest when you're rebuilding your power valve, you do the same. Have everything cleaned, have it all laid out, and then you know that you're not going to be leaving anything behind. So the first thing to do is to fit the main flap. Start with a bit of 2-stroke oil, put some on the end of these 2 retaining pins. I'm going to start with the cylinder upside down at this stage. Put these 2 pins in through the side of the cylinder, there and there. Just gently set them in place, don't screw them in. Then slide the main flap in upside down, and then you should be able to start to screw in the pins either side, just gently, and it should hold the main flap in place. So I can now turn this the right way up and the main flap isn't going to fall out at all. Now, there is a spec in the manual that off the top of my head says that you want, I think, 0.2 of a millimetre of side-to-side movement in this main flap. So in other words, you do up these 2 side pins and then back them out a total of 0.2 of a millimetre. The reality is that you can just set these pins so that the head of them, if you can see here, you've got the 8mm head and then you've got a step down. You want that step down there to be basically flush with the aluminium housing here. So if you set it like that on both sides, you really can't go wrong. That will give you more than 0.2 of a millimetre side-to-side movement, but it's not much. It's probably 0.5, maybe 0.6 of a millimetre, but that works perfectly well. I'll now go ahead and put the retaining plates in for these pins. So they just sit down like that. They're held in place each with one of these small 6mm head bolts. I'll just get some Loctite. I always use a small amount of blue Loctite on those outer 6mm bolts. And just do them up by hand. It's a small bolt, it doesn't need to be stupidly tight. So then flip it over, do the other side, take the retaining bracket, take one of the short 6mm bolts, some Loctite on it, do it up. Just do it up hand tight. So that's our main flap in place. The next stage is to drop down the rod that goes down through the top, which is this part here. It's got a threaded end on the end of it, and it's got like a T-shaped tip to it. This T-shaped bit is what goes down and engages with a couple of pins in the top of the main flap. The simplest way to put this in is to take one of your long 6mm bolts, screw it into the end. There's a reason why they threaded this, and it's so that you can do that. Bit of 2-stroke oil all around it. And in order to get it to engage with the pins in the main flap, you need to put it in sideways, and then we'll rotate it. Actually, I better show you this more clearly. On the front face of it, there's a cutout here. So you put it in sideways, and then you want to rotate it so that that cutout is facing forwards. So I'll do that, put it in sideways. I can feel it pushing against the flap, rotate it, and that should, once you rotate it 90 degrees, it should be locked in position. I can now lift that up and down, and it's lifting the main flap. For the moment, I'm just going to leave that bolt in there. I can undo that later. The next part that you need is this piece here. The pin on the end of this goes straight in, and that pin engages with the cutout that was on this part that we just put in here. So once again, a bit of 2-stroke oil all over it. If you look down in through this hole here, you can see the cutout there. So I'll just put this in so that the pin somewhere it'll want to engage. Yep, there we go. I just had to lift it slightly. Now what you'll find when this thing is in place properly, I should be able to rotate that part that I've put in, and it should lift the main flap up and down. If it's doing that nicely, you know that everything's in position properly. So that's good. Now, you probably won't see it on the video, but if you look very carefully on one of the teeth of this part that we've just put in, there's a very small mark. That is a reference mark that we use later on to engage with this reference mark here on this plate. So the next step is to take these next 2 cylinders and install those. Now these are actually marked differently. These each have their own reference marks. The cylinder that goes on the left-hand side has a single dot above one of the teeth, and the cylinder that goes on the right-hand side has 2 dots, one each above 2 separate teeth. Now if you forget that, you can go to this plate and double check. So down on the left side here, we have a single mark there. We have a single mark at the top, but on the right hand side, we have 2 individual notches. Hopefully you can, there you go, hopefully you can see that clearly. So we'll start with our left hand cylinder with the single dot on it. Drop that into position. At this stage you want to make sure that it rotates smoothly, which this one does. Then we'll go and get the other cylinder with the 2 dots on it and drop that down into position. Same thing again, rotate it, spin it all the way around, make sure it works properly, which it does. We then need to come over here. One thing I didn't show you before, there are 6 of these very small little collars. If you're missing any of these, my suggestion is stop what you're doing and go and buy the extras that you need, because they're really important. Now, these 6 collars go on the 3 pins that are here. So there's 1, 2, 3 pins. First of all, we want to drop a collar onto each pin and drop them upright, so the large diameter of the collar is downwards. So we'll drop one of the collars onto each of the pins. So these collars are used to hold this plate in place. So this plate actually sits on those collars as it rotates side to side. So if you don't have those collars there, your power valve won't work properly. So we'll leave the other 3 collars to the side for the minute, and we'll come to our plate. Now you need to, as you set the plate down in here, I'm just going to roughly sit it there. It's not engaged with the teeth. But what you need to do at this stage is rotate each of these 3 cylinders so that the small dot is in line with the reference line on the plate. So we've got 1 here, 1 there, and 2 there. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Sometimes you need a very small little screwdriver to do this with, which I might actually go and get now. So I'm using a tiny little screwdriver just to engage each of these, just rotating the cylinders around. And when you get them into the right spot, this bracket should drop down into place like that. Now you can gently test it. You can see that's moving. Now what I need to do is I'll put a bit more 2-stroke oil on these pins, and then I'll drop the other 3 collars down. Now this time when you're putting these collars on, you want to put them downwards, so you see the large diameter is then at the top and the small diameter is facing downwards. It's fairly intuitive when you're actually doing it. And I'll lift this up. Hopefully you can see, for instance, down on this one. You can also see that one there and the one at the top. Now when I move this fork, you can see that all 3 cylinders move. The main flap is moving up and down, and everything's moving quite smoothly. If it doesn't move smoothly at that stage, you've got to stop what you're doing, and you've got to figure out why. Normally, if it's not moving smoothly, normally it's because these 2 side cylinders here and here are catching on something further down in the cylinder. So often you've got to get in there with a Dremel or some sort of sanding tool and very carefully clean out those holes that these cylinders sit into. Normally when they bind, it's to do with either one or both of these cylinders. So the final piece in order to hold all this together is this plate here. Sit that down and then use the 2 medium length bolts. I normally put a bit of blue Loctite on these ones as well. It's maybe a little bit of overkill, but you don't want them coming out. And same thing again, just do them up hand tight. So there we go, so that's all now held in position. I can be a bit more forceful with this now. That's rotating very smoothly. And that's all good to go. So now, normally what we would now do is put this, put a gasket over here and then put the front cover down. I'm not going to do that just yet because this cover is quite dirty, so I'm actually going to go and bead blast this just to tidy it up for the customer. If we were going to proceed though, what we would do is take the 6 longer bolts. Now bearing in mind I've still got one in here, so now's a good time to remove this bolt from here. So we'd take the 6 longer bolts and we'd use them in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 positions. We've also got 2 exhaust spring retaining brackets. They sit in the 2 centre holes. So I'll just drop those in there. As I said, I'm not going to do this up just yet, but your 2 exhaust spring brackets go here and here, and then the other 4 bolts go there. So I'll pull it off for now, but you get the picture. The only other thing left to do is to do up the side covers. So there's one here and there's one here. Now once again, I'm not actually going to properly do these up because I don't have a gasket kit open, but normally if you are doing this at home, you'd fit a gasket there. That cover goes on, and then you would use 2 of these small 6mm head screws to do this up, and just do them up by hand. So that one would go there with a gasket under it, and this one with the hose attached to it would go on this side. Same thing, you'd have a gasket underneath it, and it's held in place with 2 of the short 6mm head bolts. Now personally I actually leave this cover off until the engine is fully back together and in the frame. The reason is, inside here is your reference mark for the power valve, and this enables you to tell how the power valve is set up. I'll just try and angle that properly. Hopefully what you can see there is there are 2 reference marks on, there's 2 plates here, one that moves and one that's stationary. So you can see the moving one there. The moving plate has a single notch in it that you can see, and the stationary plate has an upper notch there and a lower notch there. Now when you're setting up your power valve and the engine is fully together, there's a big nut that you can rotate on the opposite side of the engine, and when you rotate that big nut you'll see that it will change the position of this marking here. Roughly speaking, the ideal position to set your power valve is so that the single moving notch is just in line with the bottom edge of the top notch. I know that sounds a bit complicated, but hopefully if I can bring that right up to the camera. There you go, hopefully you can see that. So you can see the 2 notches on this side, the top one and the bottom one, and you can see the other notch on the other side which moves. When the engine's off, you want the notch on this side to be level with the bottom of the top stationary notch. There's no other easy way of saying it. So hopefully you get the picture. These are great little engines. With a little bit of maintenance to the power valve, you should get pretty good life out of them. Thanks for watching the video.